History at Queen's University in Canada. Welcome, Professor Adnan Husain to ObservActu TV. You're an associate professor of medieval, Mediterranean, and Islamic world history at Queen's University in Canada. And you are also the host of Guerrilla History and the Adnan Husain Show on YouTube. Welcome, and thank you for joining us and accepting to answer some of our questions.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Bashir, for this kind invitation. I look forward to our conversation, inshallah.
Okay, thank you. So our conversation today is around broader questions regarding Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, the broader Middle East situation, and we're interested in trying to understand if we're witnessing a reshaping of the world order or not, if we are witnessing a change in Western hegemony, maybe an end to it, or a transformation in the way it functions. And so in so doing, I'll have a few questions for you, and on recent developments and basically on the Gaza war and the related events to that, the implications of this on the global South, and of course recent US-Iran confrontation, its implication in the region, like in Lebanon and other places. So first of all, my first question to you would be that do you believe that the war in Gaza represents a historic turning point, not only for the Middle East, but also for the international system?
I certainly believe that it is a pretty momentous and world-defining, world-making series of events during the course of the Gaza genocide. In some ways, did it reveal the way the world was operating, perhaps in clearer ways, or is it itself a transformation? I think it actually is both. It shows how the inequities of the world system, the hypocrisies of Western empire and the international system that it had created, with institutions like the International Court of Justice, the UN agencies, the so-called rules-based international order, international humanitarian law, human rights law. All of these kinds of institutions were clearly, of this liberal order, were clearly flawed and were never meant in some ways perhaps to apply to the colonized world or formerly colonized world. But this wasn't always so apparent and perceived to people. And what the Gaza genocide revealed and accelerated, in my view, a direction that the world was already heading towards was the way in which certain parts of the world, Fortress Europe, was it Joseph Borrell, the former EU official, who characterized Europe and the idea of the West as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle, right? And this kind of relationship reproduces the colonial order. It's just that it had been masked through other mechanisms. And Gaza, and the genocide in Gaza, and the willingness of the entire, you might call the political establishment, the economic, corporate, political elites of the West, Europe, North America, Europe and its successful settler colonies, were all totally committed to supporting the Zionist entity and the Zionist project as a component of Western empire, as an extension of Western empire, in ways that they would be willing to completely dispose of the whole charade of liberal order to be committed to it. And I think, in my view, as a medieval historian, somebody who studied and studies and researched Muslim, Christian, Jewish relations in the medieval Mediterranean world, and particularly the Crusades, I would argue that it's really not possible to understand and explain such an enormous contradiction without seeing the present state of the West as always being committed in various ways to a kind of crusader society and crusading, this idea of Western hegemony needing to be extended over the whole world, and that the crusader states in that pivotal, very important geostrategic location at the crossroads of trade routes that are still very important as we see today. You know, when you think about the Red Sea through the Suez, or the Persian Gulf, like the Indian Ocean trade connecting Europe and North Africa to the East, that this is a pivotal part of the world system, and that they have been trying to maintain control over it and the resources of the region since the time of the Crusades, even if the language around its forms of colonization and control have changed and updated over time to be in a secular language, in racial language, colonial, you know, in colonial times, or in liberal language that we have seen, you know, now all of those modes and ways of trying to characterize the basis for Europe's superiority and supremacy are, you know, now being reconfigured and exposed for what they are.
Okay, well, on this question of crusade as a pattern that comes across time and continues till this day, I guess Israel represents that new chapter in the 20th century. But I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that this, you know, this backing of Israel has been affected in one way or another after the events in Gaza? Some people talk of just because of the strength of the images that came out, and the kind of new awareness that was building up in Western societies, that there may have been a change, or at least Israel's image has been affected to a certain extent. I mean, we can see that there's all sorts of pressures, at least very shy and very timid in many ways, across the world, in Europe and even in the US, to kind of rein in on, or at least affect, have a you know, an impact on, or at least have a change in the way Israel operates. Not that the backing is gone, of course, and I'm sure you're going to argue against that to a certain extent. But is there any change at that level? And to what extent, you know, to what extent do you think is there a change in that?
Well, I think there has been a massive sea change when it comes to popular opinion, when it comes to the global, you know, free peoples of the world, as it were. You know, that's a phrase that comes from some of the resistance communications. They talk about the free peoples of the world, you know, in some sense of common humanity being recognized. This was very evident. And there's been a lot of solidarity movements in various ways, demonstrations. We've seen this. I happened to have been in London during that period, and every 2 weeks there was a national march in the fall of 2023 for, it seemed, 15 months almost, you know, and continuing on. So that obviously represents a huge shift in the image of Israel, and represents a lot of sense of solidarity with the Palestinian people. But at the same time, unfortunately, there are issues that have prevented that changed in public opinion and collective solidarity into a genuine political program that has been capable of affecting the complete dedication of the political and economic elites. And so what it exposed in some sense is that among the many fictions, you know, of the liberal rules-based order of the international system are also what are the natures of so-called Western democracies. And it's clear and it's evident in a whole range of policies, not just the Gaza genocide, that uh, people are not governed according to the will of the people. The policies that are implemented in governments across the so-called West are not always responsive to popular will. And this is especially the case when it comes to foreign policy and what we might say the commitment to empire and all of the defense and intelligence and security industries that are collectively committed to a vision of the world and the way it needs to be governed. So I think while there is more political pressure, and it has definitely undermined the self-perception as well of Israeli society, where it used to be that perhaps the BDS movement, modeled on the global anti-apartheid movement and the boycott and divestment and sanctions that many people credit with having played an important role in bringing an end to the racial apartheid system of South Africa, is not necessarily well calibrated to the new realities, which is that within Israeli society, it seems that where once they wanted to be included in international fora, they were concerned about their image. A sports boycott was something that would have affected them dramatically. It seems that now it has turned very inward. It recognizes, and in fact, even seems to take a certain kind of pride in thwarting and provoking, this kind of outrage around the world. It doesn't matter to the people who now seem to rule in that society. And we note that the Gaza genocide is still a popular policy. The war on Iran, was still very popular. There may be discussions within Israeli society about how it should be conducted, but we see the enormous reaction from right-wing as well as so-called left-wing parts of the political spectrum in Israel to the proposed negotiations and the kind of memorandum of understanding that has recently been released. So it shows that this society has increasingly transformed into a very racially divided, oppressive, aggressive form of racial and ethno-religious supremacy, that some of the techniques of sort of shaming it in the, excluding it from civilized society, as it were, like of the West, I'm not sure that's going to work so much, partly because not only within Israel do they not seem to care about that as much, and they're pursuing a policy of trying to be perhaps something like a regional hegemon, anticipating perhaps the end of U.S. support or decline of the U.S. empire itself, and they are preparing for that kind of reality. But the other side of it is that the West itself is no longer that concerned with blatant racism, with violations, as we were talking about before, of human rights and liberal order and so on, and is also tilting towards xenophobia, racism, exclusion, particularly of Muslims. So that, there's a symmetry and a similarity in some ways between the larger West and Israel as a kind of crusader state on behalf of the West. That means that the politics of the situation has changed, even if many people around the world, including in the West, who don't actually have the kind of political voice they've been told that they have in a democratic society, that unfortunately, that seems that there's very little that this global public opinion on its own can really do to intervene and change, change the fate and save, the project of Palestine without other kinds of intervention.
Okay, but so I appreciate the explanations here. Just to push the argument further, I mean, some people would say that, okay, if it's it's a war of imperialism and a perdurance of colonial structures, then it seems sometimes that it may not be in the interest of the West to just be backing Israel, and that some people would say, well, the point is actually to build Western hegemony in the region, and sometimes Israel can be an impediment to this. For example, having good relations with the Gulf region, even maybe find a deal with the Iranians, or I mean, this seems to be sometimes at odds with actually keeping a complete alignment with Israeli interest. So, what do you think of that?
That is, I think, a common case of empires where some of its vassal states and allies can sometimes embroil them in conflicts that weaken the empire. But it isn't. It's in my view, on a deeper and broader structural level, anything more than tactical considerations about where one locates your interests and your priorities. So if you think about some components of the US elite, they might be concerned that this is putting at risk other relationships that are very valuable in the region, particularly with the Gulf states and other military allies, say like Egypt and Turkey. The population is very committed to solidarity with Palestine, right? And if you take a poll, I believe, of Turkish citizens, you'll have 98% have a very dismal view of Israel and would love their country to be more active, perhaps in helping prevent the slaughter and genocide of Palestine. The same in Egypt, but the political elites of these countries are still completely subject to the, overall system. I mean, if you're a member of NATO, or if you have a military alliance with the United States, or your vision of security is based on expecting the superpower to guarantee it, we can see what those guarantees ultimately really mean, but it shows that there has been a system that has co-opted the political ruling and governing elites of West Asia, so that there might be costs that might come, but overall the system continues to have a predominating effect, and it is to the benefit of U.S. empire to still maintain Israel as a kind of regional hegemon. If at some point it becomes too costly, we can see, just as there are tensions on the U.S. right currently, where there is criticism of this, we might see some tensions, we might see some small restraints, but it doesn't seem to me that the cost is the primary or only way in which U.S. and Western empire is being guided. And that's why I do look at the longer history. And I do think that it is very important that we understand the significant role of Islamophobia in structuring politics in the West. I don't think one can understand the politics in any of these countries of Europe, North America, and so forth, without really understanding the constituting role that Islamophobia is currently playing in organizing, political life, cultural life, social life. And that ideological kind of commitment has such a long history that I don't think it's very easy for the Western leadership to really imagine a different way of organizing both their domestic politics right now and the world system, right? It's very hard for the United States to really see how it could be a country like other countries, even if a very powerful country, but a country like other countries in the world system. There's been some talk about it. The defense, there was last year, around this time, I think, a new defense, policy paper in the U.S. that suggested that the U.S. would not be able to, impose itself so fully over all regions of the world, and that it should perhaps focus almost like a new Monroe Doctrine on the Western Hemisphere and on building up, its resources for a potential confrontation to constrain China's influence in, in Asia. But it hasn't actually followed through with that. It has found itself completely committed to supporting, Israel, and being, led into a very costly and destructive war in West Asia against Iran, and you could say overall the axis of resistance. And even though there is a memorandum of understanding now, structurally speaking, I think it would be very foolhardy to predict that this is the end of the war rather than yet another pause in a broader conflict. And that shows that there is a kind of ideological commitment both to kind of hegemony, but also specifically in this region that it historically has had so many periods of conflict since the Crusades, through the era of colonialism, through the global war on terror, which was kind of another extension of attempting to, renew U.S. imperial sort of control in the region, into today. And over the course of all this time, we've seen that Islamophobia, hatred, and bigotry towards Muslims, works both domestically and seems to guide a lot of these, foreign policy decisions. And that sentiment, Islamophobic sentiment, has, if anything, grown, over this period since, say 9/11, over the last 20 plus years. Instead of waning, it has become even more useful as a mechanism for organizing politics. And we see the emergence of the far right. We focus a lot of times on the far right, but I would say it's just as present in its own way in some components of the progressive left, and certainly in the political center. And that's why I say I don't think one can understand politics in the West without really taking a close look at the functioning of Islamophobia as a kind of guiding principle organizing politics.
I mean, it's clear that the far right in a place like the UK has really yet transformed itself even more since the Brexit vote, and has become really the mainstream right party and the party on the, and even has led to almost an obsolescence of left-wing politics. I mean, the kind of it comes out logically from what you're saying. But to come back to the
but on that, look at even, however, the Labor government, right? So Islamophobia is what is driving even the Labor government in some ways to reproduce a lot of the policies that the right wing would have wanted to put in.
Because they're trying to keep up with the right.
Because there's the deeper sort of logic that in a time of crisis, perhaps they retreat to this kind of sense of the threat of the outsider, of those who don't belong. That is racialized. It's also configured around religion. And even if they have a very secular idea and mentality, Islam and Muslims are always presented as exceptional cases in the logics and discourses of, politics and culture, in the West. Is that this represents, like, it's fine for everything, but, the Muslim is somehow an exceptionally dangerous figure that cannot be integrated into, normal society. So this is something that's deeper even than the right-left kind of competition. It seems to me is that there's fundamentally a framing of the Muslim as outside the antithetical to multicultural or multi-religious democracy, right? That it's the one exception that is what can be used to structure politics. And we see that with, the persecution of those who are, in solidarity with Palestine by institutions, the judiciary, government. So I think there is a deeper logic at work.
Okay. No, thanks for this, Adnan. So to come back to the Middle East as a region, do you see yet still a transformation in how in the balance of power there, in terms of maybe Iran, emerging as stronger or weaker from what's happening now, and does this signal a decline in American influence in the region, or the opposite, or a renewed leverage in the region, especially with the deal that was signed a day or two ago? Bearing in mind that Israel is trying as much as possible to torpedo this deal, and it's been doing this for the past few months now, by bombing in Lebanon. Do you see? So what does this tell us about the powers in the region?
Well, I mean, I think it is potentially transformative period, but it's one of contestation. So the outcomes are unknown. There's going to be a lot of contestation, competition, to see, what a kind of stable system might look like. We're in a very transitional point, and I think you're right that it is both a mark of Western, and particularly, we don't even really need to speak of Europe. They're not really the decision makers in this. But when we speak of kind of the West, we're really talking about its leadership under the U.S. and the U.S.'s commitment to, the Israeli project. And we were seeing that there are, because of the high costs of U.S. intervention in this war on Iran, and the way it has spread and become a regional war, as many commentators, particularly on the Iranian side, would have said it would definitely become, that the costs have been very high for U.S. prestige, for the image of its military performance and capabilities. What we've seen is that it is possible to bombard through a kind of air power, but that doesn't necessarily change the material facts on the ground or achieve the political goals of the intervention, unless the political goal is just to sow destruction and chaos, which I believe is perhaps in some ways an acceptable outcome for Israeli planners and some of the U.S. planners, perhaps, is just prevent this region from developing through it in its own sovereign sort of form. And if that requires, what the U.S. did to Iraq, to Syria, to Libya, to so many countries in the region over the last 30 and 40, years of military intervention, it's perhaps willing, to do that, to prevent, West Asia as a world region, as a center of energy, from actually becoming sovereign and developing. But if we look at the so-called interest that they have in stability, it's clear that some kind of new balance is being, worked out. And I do think that the Gulf states and all of those projects are very much affected because they relied upon a particular model of security and stability, and selling an image of basically how you could live in a way in the region without really being of the region, and attracting all this capital and expats. That is not a sustainable model for the whole region. And we have to understand that they are a product entirely of, British colonial control, that, and then, reinforced by the U.S. System in the region as a way of sequestering the wealth of this region into the hands of a small, corrupt, dependent, elite, right? And to prevent the resources of this vast oil and energy, natural gas wealth from being invested in the human social development of the main population. So it's no accident that, you have all of these tiny, weak, dependent states that are fully aligned with both the Zionist and U.S. project in the region, basically wasting the resources that could be used to develop this whole society. And so what Iran is representing, it seems to me, is a challenge to that. They paid a heavy price for their sovereignty. They're the only region the only country in the region that is actually sovereign, in the sense that they make their decisions and they choose their path, but they're of course constrained by 47 years of sanctions, 8 years of war from from Iraq that was sponsored and supported by regional and regional allies in the Gulf and Western, vassal states, and the West as a whole. The constant subversion, attempts at color revolutions, now these additional wars. So they have paid an enormous and heavy price to try and remain sovereign. But they are demonstrating that with, great determination and sacrifice, it is possible to develop on a path that gives hope and promise. I think the other point is that this war is totally connected to the Gaza genocide, because the isolation of Iran, I don't think, has that much to do with things like the, nuclear program that they have and so on. I think fundamentally the isolation of Iran is because it has never really abandoned the cause of Palestine. And that's why they've been made to suffer, because what they've chosen to do with their sovereignty is continue to represent a vision of the Middle East as decolonized, sovereign, and independent. So I am hopeful that this may create a new balance, and that some of the other elites within, at least the powerful countries like Turkey, Egypt, Saudi, Pakistan, can see that their interests might be more in developing a kind of collective regional program of development and security that would allow the vast majorities of the people of the region to achieve the benefits of the resources of the region and work together. That is a possibility in a weakening of the US empire and the rise of countries like, China as the chief superpower economically, anyway, that a rebalancing of the world system could mean that the region itself could realign for its own purposes. And that has to be a hopeful possibility and outcome of so much chaos, destruction, and suffering that this region has been subjected to for, a century, nearly a century, with Zionist colonization, but, with all the wars, but especially since the global war on terror, the last 20 plus 30 years or so.
And so in that sense, in that idea of emergence of alternative powers, or not, different global powers in the region, what would you say here is the role played by, or probably a future role, or the present role played by powers like Russia and China and the BRICS countries, in contributing to this?
Well, I think the BRICS started with some very useful and interesting ideas to try and have what we might think of as South-South cooperation, right? Something that goes back to as far as like the Bandung Conference in 1955, the Afro-Asian conference that, was in some ways the birth of the project of the non-aligned movement that was concerned with big problems like global security and the possibility of war and the nuclear age. These were newly freed or liberated countries that wanted to find an alternate to being forced into a military alliance or pact either with the West in the extensions of NATO, which we saw, at the same time, the Baghdad Pact, the Central Treaty Organization being established, the SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, all built and modeled on NATO, and all having the US as the sort of lead sponsor in the military alliance. So some countries didn't want to be forced into that, and they also didn't necessarily want to be have to be committed to a military alliance with the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, but they were interested in developing in a sovereign way for, their people, and they decided we need some kind of collective project. And so that dream, or the spirit of Bandung from 1955, was very important in establishing the non-aligned movement, the tricontinental, and other mechanisms for reorienting and organizing this world of nation states outside of the Western imperial system. That dream, of course, was never really fulfilled. The Cold War undermined it. The unipolar period of U.S. Hegemony after the breakup of the Soviet Union, put back a lot of developmental projects, and the promises of this new era of neoliberal global capitalism have also only increased inequality. So the BRICS, to try and break out of the regime of the IMF and the World Bank and the financial system that prevented, financing projects for development and so on, and encumbered societies with so many conditions where they had to undermine their own social development, cutting education, cutting, this was a disaster for the global South. And so I see the BRICS as having responded by trying to build some new institutions like the, financing for development, right? Like a new People's Bank kind of as an alternative, trying to move away from the dominance of the US dollar and so on. But unfortunately, what I would say about the BRICS project is that it's pretty ideologically incoherent. It's a little bit like the Bandung, meeting, in that there are some very pro-Western, pro sort of kind of Western capitalist style kind of affiliated countries that still want, of course, to pursue some of their own interests and be part of BRICS. There are others that are more aligned, perhaps you might say, with a social kind of understanding. But this is not the era, clearly, of kind of great ideology. So each of these countries is looking to its own interests. I'm hopeful that perhaps what Iran has shown is that it is possible to stand up to some extent militarily to the US empire. And as a result, it may encourage movement and cooperation and taking some kind of risks. The problem is that the US has imposed unilateral sanctions on many countries that have devastated them. And we've seen them: Cuba, Venezuela, Sudan, Syria, terrible sanctions, Iran, Iraq. Like a third of the world has been suffering under unilateral and illegal US sanctions that have imposed all kinds of restrictions and difficulties on, those societies economically. It has led to 30 million people being killed since the 1970s, according to a very important Lancet study about the effect and consequences of US sanctions. So it has been devastating, and it has been very dangerous to directly confront the United States or try to break out of the system. But I think what is happening now may give encouragement to actually reorient and realign. And if the BRICS could be a vehicle for that, it would be, beneficial. But I think so far the BRICS has been a mixed bag and has not necessarily had a kind of coherent strategy. When Argentina joins and it's under a very extreme right-wing, pro-US fascistic kind of government, was, at Brazil's behest, was included in BRICS. I mean, you're just introducing, along with India already, that is kind of in its own geopolitical position that includes a close alliance, increasingly close alliance with the Israelis, and a westward orienting. I mean, it's very hard then to build a kind of new project that would be free of and present a counter or an alternative to the Western and international system such as it exists. So we will have to see whether recent events and Iran's example is demonstrating perhaps some possibility that might be encouraging to these countries to see their interests in collectively building together an alternate system.
Okay, then, if you're looking now at the, if we were asking this question about states and about the possibility of the emergence of a different pole in the region and beyond, my next question is about Arab public opinion, and also how does this impact on the legitimacy of government, especially following the Gaza war and the regional conflicts that we're facing now. How does this impact public opinion in the Arab world, and does this have any impact on government that have close Western ties with Western powers?
Well, this is a really fascinating issue to observe, what will be happening, whether, there might be some changes. After the wave of the so-called Arab Spring, that had the possibilities for some popular social changes and movements to express themselves in new political arrangements, it's been a kind of dark period since then, that the Gaza genocide has only worsened in terms of morale and a sense of fatalism. I mean, it seems to me, I'm concerned about that, because while there's universal sense of solidarity with the cause of Palestine, this hasn't been able to express itself in anything other than kind of basic opinion, but there's been no ability for collective action politically. The states, that are ruling and governing, the vast majority of Arab populations in the region are very hostile to any public demonstrations, because it would put pressure on the security situation. I mean, you just think of Egypt, for example, right? I mean, Egypt, right next door to Gaza, many people, being evacuated from Gaza, but they were actually prevented, from coming in and seeking shelter in many ways. And at the same time, there was, no concerted effort. I mean, I think Egypt accomplished something very important, that it did not want, the entire Gazan population to be displaced and, kind of pushed into the Sinai for its own reasons, as well as perhaps, the sense that this is an outrageous injustice. And, we have to support the right of Palestinians to live on their land. But of course, during the, genocide, we're watching people being slaughtered, and, neighboring governments, bordering governments, unable to, make any kind of intervention other than preventing, a massive refugee, crisis for themselves. This is really a kind of dismal situation. So I don't know, what is going to happen with Arab popular opinion. I think the legitimacy of these governments could easily be questioned by people thinking, like, what is the basic function of any of these governments would be to protect its people. The problem is with this era of nation states, the way we've absorbed the reality of these colonial borders that have divided this region into very recent kind of entities like Lebanon, like Syria, like Jordan, divided them from one another as separate states. That while we have that kind of broad sentiment and connection, politically speaking, everyone is organized in these kind of separate political entities, and the pursuit of their own interests goes against the solidarity that the people genuinely feel for one another, because they are fundamentally the same or very connected people. So I think it's a moment where many of these states and governments have failed so miserably to show some kind of solidarity and effectiveness that it could be, it could have ramifications in the future. And I think there is a deep kind of, I don't know if we could call it envy. I don't think it's envy, but it's you look and you see that at least people in southern Lebanon, at least people in Yemen, at least people in parts of Iraq, at least the people of Iran are able to actually express their political will against, the oppression and genocidal violence and expansionism of the genocidal, Zionist entity. So, people must feel so I don't know, politically derailed, from like achieving what they aspire to and what they can see those who have fought and managed with great sacrifice. I mean, it did not come and has not come easily, and they're facing themselves the genocidal violence of Israel, the US empire, but they have a dignity. Like the Palestinians have an incredible dignity as humans that cannot be compensated for or overvalued by any material, element. And that is something that I think there is a deep yearning after generations of colonial and post-colonial, the promises of post-colonial independence never fully materializing, that there is a deep yearning for some sort of collective sovereign expression. One hope that I have, and I don't know, if it will take this shape, is that there might be some kind of revival of an ummatic kind of sentiment, that is really the only expression politically in an organized fashion for the will of this of the people of this region. And I don't mean in a narrow kind of Muslim exclusive way, but I mean in the sense that the people of the region feel and have experienced that they are connected with one another, but their present political conditions isolate them from one another. I also don't think, and this is a whole other topic that gives me, great concern, is also the reviving of sectarian kinds of discourse and language, which I think is in some sense a response to the fact that much of the axis of resistance is led by Shia of different kinds, actually, a variety, Zaidi in Yemen, Ithna Ashari, 12er Shi, Imami Shi's in southern Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. And so that one of the kind of very useful tools of the empire is to try and foment and stoke sectarian division. When it can, it does ethnic division, but this is also a tool, is to stoke sectarian division, to try and divide what I think are the genuine, authentic feelings of sympathy and solidarity that people have, but to try and confuse that, to try and suppress that from taking shape in a political fashion. There is an interest in promoting and stoking differences on the basis of theology, as if the reason why Iran is being attacked has anything to do with the fact that they have some differences in their law, and they believe in the imam and so on. It has nothing to do with that. It has only to do with the fact that they are Muslims trying to assert sovereignty in the state of the region and global affairs, and that is considered dangerous and a challenge to both Israeli vision of its security as unchallengeable hegemon in the region, and of course of Western empire.
Okay, yeah, thanks for this clarification. But then the other actors that we want to ask about then in this case are the international institutions. I mean, you've talked about this in the beginning. The UN, the ICG, the International Criminal Court, they've all been under intense scrutiny. Have these institutions been strengthened or weakened by recent events? We've seen the ICC to step up at some point in a bold, if not sensational, at least, verdict about the likelihood of genocide. But and also all these investigation on Israeli officials, and But what does this do? Is it is there anything tangible about all of this?
Well, so far, I mean, I think they've been more symbolic and, potentially politically, useful if they're connected with wider popular political movements. Like, I don't think that the institutions themselves, they can clearly be sidelined or their judgments ignored by the governing political, elites in Europe and North America. The case in North America is that the United States, of course, is not even a party to the Rome Statute for the ICC, so it wouldn't even recognize these. But even those countries that do ostensibly recognize these as valid international law and conventions to which they are a party have been very adept at ignoring the actual implications and refusing to implement them. So I don't have a lot of confidence that merely gaining some legal judgments or institutional statements are by themselves effective. I think they can. I'm not saying we shouldn't be contesting these as cases and we shouldn't be organizing through and around and outside those institutions to put pressure on them. But I think they will only be meaningful when there is also a large social political movement that's making these demands heard and unignorable, right? That's so, for example, what's happened in basically the loss of credibility of the judicial system in the UK in the way that it's willing to discard basic political rights to pervert the course of the trials in order, maybe even within the law, but the kind of way in which it is being, pursued clearly has everything to do with political priorities of the Labour government, of its connections to Israel and so forth, that it is possible to undermine the credibility and the validity of judicial institutions. It doesn't mean that you don't contest these in court, like the proscription ban of Palestine Action that is followed this process where now it has been upheld, right, on appeal. It has been upheld. Is that a loss? Is that, of course, it's a kind of loss, but the victory wasn't also just a victory. I mean, really, both of these decisions, first to maybe say it was wrong to prescribe Palestine Action, and the decision now to uphold the original prescription, neither of them is just a victory or a loss. They are indices of where does the collective political organizing go? And now it makes it very clear that remedies through the judicial system are reaching their political end, that it's no longer possible for the UK government to maintain the policy that it wants, absolute support for Israel, and maintain the fiction that it has a fair, democratic, system of political rights. I mean, that becomes increasingly, clear as you push through the system and achieve these sorts of results. And that just means that there will have to be more popular organizing for people now to understand that if they want to have any kinds of political rights, to contest the actions of their government, to have a sit-in or a demonstration, they are actually going to have to fight for those rights now, because what used to be considered guarantees of the liberal Western democratic order are now completely contingent on whether you support their support of genocide and other terrible things that uphold the system. So that's productive. I mean, it may not be what we want. We want actually to enjoy those rights, but it's better not to live in these delusions, but actually to see things clearly and to organize together, more broadly, not just around the cause of Palestine, but the cause now of having any say in, how our societies work. That is now become a key challenge for us all.
So building on what actually you're it's good, because it's leading to my next question, and so just to summarize a little bit what you've been saying all throughout, and also to pick on one thing you've talked about in the beginning, that, you know, at the end of the day, we need to understand how Islamophobia functions in order to understand some of the dynamics of this rapport, if you want, or this relationship between Western colonial adventures and at least the Islamic world or the Middle East region and the Muslim world at large. So you've said, so there's this structure, and you say that what people need is people need to fight for these rights to be secured. So you're talking about also people here as in civil society, etc. But then also we've seen from what we've talked about is that there's also resistance projects, and there's states fighting. So let's say Iran is fighting, and then you have the resistance projects of Palestinians and Lebanon, and then Lebanese, you know, or Hezbollah. In the midst of all this, I mean, these are two different methods of work. What do you think of these two methods? To what extent do these actually can lead to a change in this, you know, dominance of at least a certain narrative of Western politics? Because at the end of the day, civil society is in the West. It can change the way Western politics functions, and that's not. I mean, the West itself, it's not inherently what's wrong. It's basically these moral, you know, the moral basis on which it operates, or its understanding of morality and a particular form of self-privilege, or at least a certain understanding of the other, or the Islamic other, or other than the Islamic. You know, you have China, you have also other hemisphere. What is to be done here? What methods work, and to what extent, and how can this lead to change, to actual durable change? It's a bit of a concluding question. We're almost towards the end here, so I'd like you to wrap up, you know, also a lot of the stuff you've been saying so far.
Well, I really appreciate that question, because really just analyzing the world is not really on its own very significant or important. I mean, we learn, we are interested, and we're curious about the world, but you know, what we want to do is change it for the better, and that does require action. It requires knowledge, but it requires also engaging collectively in some sort of effective action. And this is, of course, a big question of all political history. How do you, you know, make change? I mean, we know that the techniques and methods have to be calibrated and designed to be appropriate to the political, social, historical, you know, cultural conditions in which you find yourself. And so, you know, colonized peoples fighting against, you know, colonial rule have had to take up methods that included armed resistance, because those forces were so entrenched, you know, through their military and political and economic control, that they could not be dislodged otherwise. But it was never just a matter of you know, armed struggle through national liberation movements. I mean, you know, there were strikes, there were you know, kind of like general strikes, and there were demonstrations, there was political organizing at all sorts of levels in these societies to really free people. You know, we've seen, so there's a range of connected forms of resistance, but I would say all of it is resistance of a kind, right? And you know, for people in the West in particular, it's always been thought that, you know, that kind of, and there have been, you know, attempts over time at different periods, none of which have worked very well, especially since they were, you know, of like armed resistance of any kind, especially because they have typically been disconnected from the social movements. And so there are different techniques and there are different strategies in different contexts. But it seems to me what is important and needed is to connect these struggles, because even if, you know, we wouldn't, you know, take up, you know, kind of those forms of resistance, what is happening in the axis of resistance in West Asia, Iran, and Palestine, and so forth, they are confronting both a colonial system in the, you know, settler colonization in the case of Palestine, but the broader kind of U.S. and Western hegemony and empire in their region, and it's a question of sovereignty, and they're struggling for it in the ways that is appropriate for them. I feel our struggles here are connected not only on the specific question and issue of support for Palestine and solidarity, but if we're against war, if we want a more just society, if we want the fruits and benefits to be distributed more democratically, equally, and fairly, so that all people are, respected and valued, we are also having to struggle for people's sovereignty in Western liberal democracies, because we keep finding out over and over again that people don't enjoy, despite that being the theory and the rationale for this system, is that people do not, are not sovereign in this context. What they want is not what is implemented by the government, because those are captured and controlled by corporate and political interests and so on, of a narrow elite that is benefiting in this system and imposing this overall. And so what we need to do is really connect our struggles with the idea that what we're trying to do is change the larger world system so that peoples everywhere have sovereignty. And I think that means we need to make the case, as I've been trying to say, that everybody has a stake in the problem of Islamophobia, because it has become one of the key techniques for our own subordination and division in our societies that prevents us from exercising genuine popular sovereignty on behalf of the collective benefit of people. So we need to make that case, and we need to be in common cause with the struggles of all other oppressed groups, poor. We have to be on the front lines of, demanding equality against racism, and make those affiliations and connections so that we have a broader platform on which to build our social and political movements for justice, and really adopt the view that if one person is not free, then none of us are free. That has now become a reality, that we really feel this, right? The people of Palestine are not free. They are subjected to extraordinary violence, oppression, dispossession. We don't feel free when we see this happening in the world, and when we try and do something about it and encourage our governments not to be complicit in the continuation of crimes of genocide, we are finding our rights being taken and subordinated. And so it brings home the reality that if one of us is not free, none of us are free. That's what we are experiencing now. And if we are conscious of that, perhaps we can make more political headway and devise and develop the appropriate techniques for our struggle in our context. And we've tried the demonstrations, we've tried, holding signs and all of that. The reason why Palestine Action was proscribed is because it was being effective. And it doesn't mean effective, it doesn't mean everybody has to do direct action, but if you build your movement that actually has clear goals and sets strategies and targets, there are so many things that we can do that support and assist those who may feel like they can take direct action to stop the war machine. It needs all of us to be collectively part of that. If we divide these separately, then it's easy for it to be suppressed. But, the prescription of Palestine Action will, I think, eventually be overturned if and when there is a collective, broader kind of movement to defend those rights and to stop the genocide. If we do that, then, I think we are, on the way to figuring out what the techniques are that can bring about change in these Western societies in a way that also coordinates with the need for peoples of the global South to enjoy sovereignty outside of this exploitative imperial system as well.
Okay, well, this actually was my concluding question, which is, if okay, actually, maybe you can build on this in one, just briefly in one thought. If we could say something to today's generation, drawing from history, what they should keep in mind while observing conflicts and transformation today, what would it be?
I guess what I would say the lesson of history is both that there are victories and losses, but you will always be a winner in the sense if you affiliate yourself with the cause of justice. You will be on the right side of history. And we have to think in a more long-term way and use the fact and example of history to say not every generation will get to enjoy the benefits of its struggle, but that struggle has benefits that are for all of humanity. And if we want to be human in our time now, we have to be on the side and the cause of justice.
Thank you, Adnan. This is a very nice way to put it. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Adnan Husain, and sharing your insights and analysis with us. At a time when global power balances are evolving in the Middle East, the Middle East continues to influence international affairs, understanding the historical and geopolitical dimension of these developments is more important than ever, and you've really given us, in that sense, a very significant contribution to our understanding. Thank you to our viewers for following this conversation, and please subscribe to ObservActu TV. Share this interview if possible, and join us for more in-depth discussions on the issues shaping our world. So thank you again, Adnan, for this. And
Jazakallah. I appreciate the wonderful questions and the dialogue with you today.
You're most welcome. It's nothing. And on the contrary, this was an honor for me to participate.